It is being recorded and to be given by Dr. Margaret Ward of the Queen's University, Belfast. Margaret did her PhD from the University of West England and then returned to Belfast to Queen's. She has written a number of books. The latest one was in 2019, Fearless Women, but she has in her day written biographies of Maudon and Hannah Skeffington. But today she's going to talk about Countess Markievicz and in her time as the Minister for Labour. So I welcome Margaret and thank her very much for her willingness to give the lecture. It's over to you, Margaret.
Thank you, Noel, and thank you, very patient guests. I'm very pleased to give this Countess Markievicz lecture, and I wanted to focus on her as Minister for Labour because I think there's been so much focus on her role in the Rising and her election as the first woman in the 1918 election, but much less attention paid to her work as a minister, other than colourful accounts of her travelling around Dublin in various disguises. So before I go to look at, I've looked at the cabinet minutes and what they say about her as a cabinet minister. I'll just start by looking at how biographers have judged her. And in doing that, I think we start to get a sense of flavour of the woman. So the first biography was written in 1933 by Siona Fhuelóin, who was her first and only male biographer, and he was extremely dismissive of her performance as a minister. He acknowledged that she never missed a meeting despite the risk, but added, "It seems to me the general impression that she was not really useful at such meetings." He went on to say that she wasn't generally popular with men in revolutionary circles. It's perhaps, he said, natural that a woman's counsel and even her presence should be faintly resented by men like Collins and Brewer. So enormous misogyny at that time, and the assumption really that a woman is trespassing, I think, into a male sphere in the way that Fhuelóin frames it. Not surprisingly, Helena Maloney, a friend and colleague of Markievicz, was furious with this betrayal, and when she gave her witness statement, in her rebuttal she states, "You do not seem to have escaped from the limitations of your sex," that Markievicz allied herself with these movements because they were advancing the ideals which she had accepted years ago. "We were writing about labour conditions, women's labour in particular, years before Larkin came to Ireland, and she never abandoned or drew away from that cause." You would be seeing the covers of the books at this stage, but R.M. Fox, who wrote Rebel Women, was a socialist who also knew Markievicz, and in his Rebel Irish Women he wrote an account that was full of admiration for the woman whose meetings he often attended and whose oratory was capable of rising to great heights. For him, she worked as minister under tremendous difficulties to further the democratic ideas for which she stood. The demonstration of justice, the restriction of rents and profiteering went on, and in all these important activities, Madame Markievicz played her part. There was another Daughters of Erin, Elizabeth Coxhead. It was a study of a number of women. So it was a short biographical study that came out in 1965, and it had the advantage of including reminiscences for a number of Markievicz's contemporaries. And because it was including a number of women, it's short on detail, but Cox said, I think she said something very important, that her detractors were much too ready to give credit for success to the substitute deputies that were appointed while Markievicz was in jail, ignoring the facts, as Cox said, that the idealism, the vision, the directing brain were hers, and that foundation was what contributed to its successes. Other biographers, in considering her period as minister, have tended to emphasise her idealism and vitality, the hectic round of meetings she undertook, and her love of dressing up in order to evade possible capture. Remember, she was an actress for a time before this. Jacqueline Van Voris includes anecdotes of notable occasions, for example, Markievicz frightening one employer to agree to a settlement in an arbitration case by pretending to have a tip-off that the premises were about to be raided by the Crown forces. And Diana Norman recounts her brainwave in hiding departmental papers from British forces by placing them in a trunk full of papers in a second-hand shop and putting the price of £50 on the trunk to deter anyone from buying it. Anne Haverty follows this pattern and doesn't analyse the everyday work of the department. However, Haverty believes that while much of the Doyle work was merely propaganda, Labour was among the more effective in the practice, and she adds that Markievicz, almost alone in her sympathy with Labour, had little power to develop the more radical tendencies of the revolution, try as she might. The Finnish historian Sari Okarinen did examine cabinet records, the only one who really went into them in detail, and she concluded that Markievicz wanted to establish a nationally organised labour movement, to act as arbitrator between nationalists and socialists, and to get the Doyle to back more radical reforms, and to have, to quote, an Ireland where the sexes would be equal, where the land would provide a living for every family, and where all the different sections of the population would solve their problems together. But as she admits, this was difficult to achieve in times of peace and almost impossible to further in time of war. Lauren Arrington did a double biography of Markievicz and her husband, and it was published in 2016. She doesn't examine the cabinet minutes, but coming from a cultural studies background, she makes full use of correspondence by Markievicz to highlight her reading and sympathy with Bolshevism and her support for radical land reform, which sprang both from her study of Connolly and the Russian Revolution, and her familiarity with the landscape and tenets of the west of Ireland. In her ministerial role, Arrington highlights the establishment of conciliation boards and the employment bureau the ministry set up, but she doesn't go into further detail. Her most recent biographer, Lindsay Norton, and I'm pleased to see Lindsay's face just a moment ago, devotes some attention to Markievicz as a Labour minister, interspersed with other biographical information, but doesn't use cabinet records. And she says things like Labour got the smallest allocation of funds of any ministry, and Constance didn't demand more, but that isn't evidenced. She says that Markievicz has worked hard, but for her, the problem was a general lack of interest in Labour matters. So that's the kind of biographical background, how she's been treated as an active cabinet member, but not necessarily with a lot of detail. So what I want to do is look at the evidence of the cabinet papers of Dáil Éireann. While they were often brief, particularly during the period when the cabinet operated underground, there is sufficient detail to draw some conclusions about the direction that she tried to steer her ministry towards. While her ministry was fragmentary due to imprisonment, so for example, she was imprisoned from mid-June until mid-October 1919, and from September the 26th, 1920 to July 1921, you can also say that about other ministers. So I'm breaking her ministry down into three periods. The first one that I'm going to look at now is December 1918 to December 1919. It's a preparation for ministry and her first period in office. So she was in jail and missed the first meeting of Dáil Éireann, but it was obvious that she was preparing herself for some role connected with Labour. She tried to educate herself in a variety of ways, and Kathleen Clarke in Holloway with her, because she was in jail during because of the German plot arrests, said that Markievicz ordered books on economics, labour, socialism and other topics, although, as Clarke said, she was skimmed through it, trying in her quick way to get the sense of it. Although she was the Sinn Féin figure with the closest connection to Labour, her appointment as minister wasn't a foregone conclusion. Clarke knew from personal experience, to quote from her, that the present leaders were not overeager to put women in places of honour or power, even though they had earned the right to both. So when she asked Markievicz how it had happened, the latter declared that she'd had to bully them, arguing that she had earned the right, and if she wasn't made a minister, she'd go over to the Labour Party. In those early days of political organisation, Markievicz appears to have glossed over difficulties, writing to her sister Eva Gore Booth, "My conception of a free Ireland is economic as well as political. Some agree with me, some don't, but it's not a sore point. Easter week comrades don't fall out. They laugh and chaff and disagree." But Markievicz's conception of policy, yes, was always rooted in the practical, wanting to see change happen as soon as possible. Throughout her ministry, she stressed the importance of establishing cooperatives as a means of ensuring a just reward for labour and good prices for the consumer. From jail, she had written to the Irish Women Workers' Union about a potential scheme whereby Sinn Féin clubs would supply milk from the country and send this to a cooperative shop in her constituency, selling the milk for 5p a quart instead of 8p. However, war conditions prevented this development. Dermot Ferreter, in A Nation Not a Rabble, stresses the degree of social and economic turmoil that existed at this period and the efforts of Sinn Féin politicians to prevent class conflict through emphasising cross-class alliances in the national interest. It's evident that Markievicz doesn't dispute this approach, but at the same time she makes plain her sympathies with the struggling working class. Ferreter provides an example of a letter she wrote to Limerick County Council, in which she criticised them for not supporting the motion that the council employ only trade union labour, and her letter says, "Far from being a coercive measure, it's a measure for the protection of the worker against the constant encroachment on their liberties by the employing classes." The question remains to what extent the rest of the cabinet shared her views. The 1st of April 1919 was the first day of the second session of Dáil Éireann and the first attended by the newly released Markievicz. The first day was concerned with procedural issues. The following day she was formally appointed as Minister for Labour. She seconded a motion that was moved by Alex McCabe from Sligo, that the Assembly pledges itself to fair and full redistribution of vacant lands and ranches of Ireland among the uneconomic holders and landless men. But whole-scale redistribution would have entailed a much more radical agenda than had been promised in the Democratic programme. After discussion, the motion was withdrawn, but a committee to consider land policy was formed. McCabe, not Markievicz, was nominated to the committee. In December 1919, the Dáil set up a national land bank to lend money to cooperatives of landless farm labourers. When there were disputes over lands, however, it would seem it was the landlords who were favoured by the courts. It was not, however, an area of responsibility for Labour, but was entrusted to the Department of Agriculture. So, imprisonment from June to October 1919. On the 13th of June, Markievicz was arrested and charged with sedition, serving 4 months imprisonment in Cork jail as a result. Tom Kelly was a brief substitute before he too was arrested. She was released on the 16th of October, and the report of Dáil Éireann on the 27th stated she would again take up the work of the department. Arthur Griffith, as acting president, added that the department has in its brief existence a good record to show. The report from Labour declared that a central conciliation board had been established for the settlement of trade disputes, and a large number of disputants had already availed of its services. On a strategic level, it was reported that statistics regarding food prices, costs of production, wages, hours, and conditions of employment were being prepared with a view to scheduling area groups, showing an approximate level of conditions, and thereby promoting stability in the employment of labour. Would this have led to greater wage equality and improvements in working conditions if this had been fully implemented? Again, it's a reflection that war conditions was making things like this impossible to achieve. We now come to the Underground Ministry in 1920. Markievicz is in office from January to September of that year. The Dáil is only able to meet on the 29th of June, 6th of August and the 17th of September, but the Cabinet continues to meet in a variety of locations, mainly in the private homes of sympathisers. Meetings were short to reduce the possibility of the ministers being caught together, and the minutes in their brevity reflect these difficulties. Markievicz wanted to have a number of issues raised in the Cabinet meeting of the 28th of February, and she sent in a list. Dermot O'Hegarty, who was the Cabinet Secretary and a person of considerable influence, sent her the Cabinet response. It wasn't feasible at the present to make grants to hospitals that have treated the suffering soldiers of the Republic. Those were Markievicz's words. On the issue of the non-cultivation of land by farmers, she was instructed to cooperate with the Minister for Agriculture in order to form a central conciliation board composed of representatives of the Farmers' Union and Labour and the ministers. On queries regarding wages in local authorities, the Secretary for Local Government would obtain any necessary information for her. I think there's a kind of pattern of non-cooperation with Labour that emerges, or at very least some kinds of prevarication of placing controversial issues in other departments, because the issue of wages in local authorities could surely have been a concern for Labour just as well as local government, but she wasn't given that responsibility. The ministry hadn't yet been fully established with regards to staffing, and this was delayed until June 1920. Dick Cotter, who'd been a civil servant before fighting in Jacob's factory during the Rising, was a highly effective departmental secretary operating under the nom de plume of Mr. Kennedy. He was appointed on the 7th of July, and he and Cumbernauld member Eilish Ryan organised the ministry office, which was based at 14 North Frederick Street. After that, the ministry submitted a lengthy report of its work, starting with the establishment of arbitration courts for trade disputes. Markievicz was careful not to undermine the significance of the trade union movement, nor to attempt to usurp their role in arbitration. She recognised that trade unions were dealing with cases every day and advised the Dáil that arbitration should only occur when both employers and workers recognised the authority of Dáil Éireann and where the matter could not be settled directly by trade union officials and employers. She explained the importance of urging the establishment of Irish trade unions. It was not only a nationalist objective. They'd found that in some cases disputes couldn't be settled as unions with English executives were unable to come to decisions that were separate from that agreed in England. The ministry was encouraging the development of an Irish engineering trades union. Those who wanted to start one had received £100 to launch their scheme at a meeting in the Abbey Theatre. There were practical benefits to having an Irish union as well, as payment of benefits was easier and union dues would be retained within Ireland and no longer lodged in English banks. An Irish musicians' union was also formed at this time. Her report explained that the ministry was discussing a scale for a minimum rate of wages on which to base labour arbitration to take the place of the British document at present in use. She added that the ministry also intended to draw up a scheme of insurance to be ready for the time it would be possible to get it adopted. The historian Arthur Mitchell, in his book on the Dáil courts, condemned her inactivity in setting a national pay scale, but I really don't think that the evidence substantiates that criticism. Cotter reported that the first real work of the department occurred at the beginning of August, when the Minister for Labour circularised all the public authorities in Ireland, suggesting a scheme for the amicable settlement of disputes that might arise between such bodies and their officials or employees. At the Dáil session of the 6th of August 1920, Markievicz announced that a scheme to set up conciliation boards had been developed to settle disputes between local councils and their employees. She asked deputies to send in names of individuals who'd be willing to act as chairman of conciliation boards or as arbitrators in ordinary labour disputes. Terence McSweeney seconded her motion, which was carried. Most public authorities had pledged allegiance to the Dáil and adopted the scheme, which was designed to challenge British machinery for settling salaries and the wages of public officials. That July, Markievicz, along with Michael Collins, Erskine Childers and others, had met some members of the RIC who'd been involved in a police mutiny in Listowel the month previously, when they'd refused to hand over their barracks to the British Army, and they subsequently resigned from the RIC. Former RIC man Jeremiah Mee was to play an important role in symbolising the RIC resistance. Markievicz invited him to join her department, where she appointed him to run an employment bureau for former RIC members to encourage further resignations from the police. And Mee devotes quite a lot of time in his memoirs to talking about this period. He recalls Madame doing things in dramatic style as she insisted on administering to him the oath of allegiance to the Irish Republic. He said, having completed the ceremony of oath-taking, she sat down, handed me another cigarette and said, "Thank God at least one RIC man has taken an oath to the Irish Republic." I afterwards discovered that the book was a book of poems by William Butler Yeats, which I think shows her kind of devilish sense of fun. According to me, Collins opposed his appointment as a dangerous man, while Markievicz retorted that she would take him into her own office, and if he proved to be a wrong-un, she'd herself do the shooting. The Cabinet minutes note that Madam may get extra staff if necessary to cope with this work, but must provide for volunteers also. Mee's appointment wasn't ratified by the Dáil until September the 10th, when Lily O'Brennan, sister of Anya Kent and a Cumann member, was appointed to organise an employment bureau for out-of-work Republicans. Early in September 1920, a circular under the name of Countess de Markievicz, Minister for Labour, was sent out to all local bodies and those who employed large numbers of workers, asking for their help in coming to the aid of men victimised because they wouldn't participate in the outrages of creameries and homes being burnt and the daily terrors and callous shootings that people were forced to endure. While few employers were in a position to offer employment, the circular appears to have been successful in encouraging further resignations from the police, as by November 1,100 men had left in protest against British atrocities in Ireland. Mee paid tribute to Markievicz's intelligence as well as to her personality. He said she was a grand person to work with and was one of the few who understood the question of the RIC as an economic rather than a political one. Markievicz was arrested in late September, which Mee felt to be a great blow. Dick Cotter, as departmental secretary, was the person who held things together in this time of uncertainty and danger. He reported to the Cabinet on Joe McGrath, her substitute, who was appointed in November, to quote, "He'd scarcely time to get a grip of the details of what had previously been done before he himself was arrested on the 2nd of December. Joseph MacDonagh became substitute minister in February 1921, but his primary focus was the organisation of the Belfast boycott. So the next period is July to December 1921, which is the period of the second Dáil and also the downgrading of the Ministry of Labour. By January 1921, Lily O'Brennan had 30 volunteers employed out of 58 applications, and 16 Cumann members had been found employment, with 21 still unemployed. Markievicz was self-deprecating about her achievement, writing to her sister Eva as she went to prison, "Well, I got it underway so that it goes on just as well without me. That wasn't too bad for an untried fool, was it?" Markievicz's return to the ministry following her release from prison during the truce of July 21 showed her to be determined to reassert her authority by putting in a request for substantial extra resources. In her opinion, the estimate submitted by Acting Minister McDonough, to quote, does not provide by any means sufficient funds for the efficient working of this department. Her revised estimate was a substantial increase, reflecting increased office costs. Staffing levels in the department had risen from 3 to 7 people. There were greater levels of activity, and she wanted to increase pay levels as well as to acknowledge the amounts of overtime that had been worked, to quote, particularly since I resumed office, and none of them up to the present have been paid for any overtime. Arbitration costs were steadily rising, and she believed they'd increase even more for the months from October to December. A second Dáil had been returned unopposed in May 1921, and Markievicz was now joined by 5 other women. The new Dáil didn't meet until August, when the more favourable conditions of the truce enabled deputies to appear in public. De Valera decided to reorganise his cabinet. He wanted, he said, a smaller executive, and in August the Ministry for Labour was one of those demoted. Being outside of the cabinet, unable to appeal directly to influential colleagues, must have contributed to the protracted negotiations on the future resources for Labour that Markievicz had already initiated. Robert Barton, a Wicklow landowner appointed to a newly created ministry, stated that agriculture, commerce and labour were under me as Minister for Economic Affairs, as De Valera considered they would be better coordinated in this manner. When the new structure was announced in the Dáil on the 23rd of August, Kate O'Callaghan rose to declare she regretted that the only woman member of the cabinet would not be given cabinet rank in the new arrangement. Mary McSweeney agreed, adding that in her view it was creating a precedent. Throughout, Markievicz stayed silent. On the 26th of August, she was proposed as minister by Sean C. O'Kelly and seconded by Kathleen Clark. In October, she informed the cabinet of her opinion that social revolution was imminent, with small outbreaks growing more and more frequent and violent, the immediate result of which will be destruction of property and much misery, which will tend to disrupt the Republican cause. She proposed that the government introduce measures such as investigating farm profits and establishing cooperatives, to quote, to show the workers that we have their interests at heart, but the cabinet rejected her advice. So correspondence between the cabinet and Labour now followed a pattern of instructions for future action, with Dermot O'Hegarty sending instructions. For example, I enclose for your information a list of the decisions affecting your department that were made at the meeting of the ministry. So the cabinet was making the decisions and she was simply being told to implement them. So, for example, on November the 25th, Labour was instructed to intervene with the Secretary of the Trades Union Congress and the Irish Engineering Union to settle the Cork rail dispute, to report on a dispute in Donnelly's bacon factory, and to develop terms of reference for a dispute in the flour mills. Labour disputes escalated in 1921 as the economic situation worsened. The Labour ministry was a buffer between Labour and employers, and it seems that this was the role the Sinn Féin leadership wanted Markievicz to undertake, rather than anything more radical. As Markievicz took the anti-treaty side, she was no longer in government after January 1922. The Labour department was then run by Joseph McGrath, a substitute minister who had taken the pro-treaty side. Dick Cotter also supported the treaty. It was reported that the work of the department is to, quote, more or less confined to settlement of industrial disputes, with on the whole gratifying results, as 51 disputes were concluded during the period. In 1924, when the Irish Free State reorganised its structures, the Ministry for Labour was abolished. So I'm just going to conclude. I mean, there were other issues that Markievicz took positions on that I talk about in a more detailed chapter on her role as Labour minister. For example, she didn't support the Belfast boycott, which might come as a surprise to people who kind of always assume that Markievicz, was in favour of the most radical or most militant policy always. But she argued very strongly that in her opinion it would reinforce partition, and she wanted only companies that were directly involved in discrimination against Catholics to be boycotted. I think there's sufficient evidence from the documents to show that she took her responsibilities as a minister very seriously. Her chief aims were to establish a nationally organised labour movement with Irish-controlled organisations, to get the Dáil to back more radical reforms on issues such as workers' pay and the use of unused agricultural land for landless labourers, and to have gender equality in a new Ireland. Thank you. That's me.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That was excellent. Would anyone like to ask a question? I'm going to turn off the recording because we don't need the recording on anymore, and that will